We're all hopeful that Matt Eberflus and Luke Getsy can provide the Chicago Bears a significant coaching upgrade from what they had under Matt Nagy and company, but it's not realistic to expect a new coaching staff alone to solve all the Bears' lingering problems from the previous regime.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. Today's episode is brought to you by Blue Nile. Make your moment sparkle with jewelry from BlueNile.com. Locked On Bears listeners get $50 off your purchase of $500 or more. It's a podcast exclusive that includes engagement. Just use our promo code LOCKEDON at checkout. On the show today, we explore this line between scheme coaching and talent and personnel, the X's and O's versus the Jimmies and Joes when it comes to this Bears team entering 2022. We'll kind of look at what we can expect this new coaching staff to do in terms of direct improvement that they will provide versus what will need to happen from the players themselves. Which players will need to play better and how much the coaching staff is involved in that process versus, new guys being brought in and needing to step up into bigger roles in Chicago, and sort of what we can and can't expect this coaching staff to fix on its own, and how much will just have to be players need to be better, and how much coaching staff can influence whether or not those players are better. I want to give a shout out to Raul Bennington on Twitter, who kind of brought some of this up into the Bears discussion. I don't know if he was the first one that brought it up on Twitter yesterday, but he was the one I was seeing sort of leading or pushing a lot of discussion with some of the other, regulars on the Bears Twitter sphere. And I thought it's a really interesting topic to kind of tease out a bit more here. This idea of scheme versus talent, because of course we looked at the previous regime and saw so many things wrong with the way Matt Nagy ran not only the offense, but in some ways the team as a whole. Not that he was the worst coach the Bears have ever had, but clearly there was a lot of criticism that we had for that coaching staff not necessarily doing things that felt like the ideal way to set up the Chicago Bears and that roster, still mostly this roster, for success last season and in previous seasons. And so when a new coaching staff comes in, there's this instant hope and gratification that, yes, okay, this coaching staff is not going to make the same mistakes of the previous regime. They're going to do the things they're going to fix the things that Matt Nagy was doing wrong, and that's going to solve so many of the Chicago Bears' problems and leave them set and ready to go and all locked in for 2022. And while that's all fine and dandy on paper and sounds great, it doesn't always work that way, and it doesn't, and even if it does at first, it doesn't always last. It seems like, and this was one of the things Raul was pointing out on Twitter, that like we've sort of heard this same type of thing before with previous Bears regimes. Like when Mark Trestman was fired, and then of course like John Fox was supposed to come in and really sort of stabilize and right the ship, and that didn't exactly happen. And of course, John Fox is fired, and Matt Nagy is going to come in and be the offensive innovator that's going to sort of take the team to the next level with in terms of like what the coaching staff and the scheme was going to do for this Bears team. And you can kind of go back to previous firings, even throughout the rest of the 2000s or whatever. Raul mentioned Dick Duran and Mike Martz and all those guys. Like, it's not as simple as just like Nagy was causing all the problems, remove him, and problem solved. There is that player talent component to it. And then there's the same sort of thing as the GM, right? Where it's like, okay, new GM is going to come in and, right all the wrongs of the previous regime. Because like when you look back at Matt Nagy's tenure, this is in no way a defense of Matt Nagy. And I think we have a pretty firm track record here of criticism of Matt Nagy as a regime. But when you look back at it more objectively here, under Nagy, the Bears did seem to be able to pretty consistently win the games they were definitely supposed to win, right? When the Bears were more talented than their opponent. You think about a lot of like the Lions games and some of the lesser teams they played. And not that this was 100% all the time, but like the vast majority of the time, the Bears beat the lesser talented teams and sort of the quote unquote the teams they were supposed to. Now, when the Bears played teams that were clearly a lot more talented, they got obliterated. And Nagy really struggled to like keep his team up with teams that just had more talent, especially, these last couple of seasons, 2018 notwithstanding. And even the games that the two teams were a little bit closer in talent, again, too often Nagy wasn't able to elevate the talent level of the players that he had to maybe beat the teams that are either equally talented or more talented. And so it's not to say that, Nagy was doing a great job by any means, but he wasn't losing. He wasn't losing to the really bad teams. He wasn't losing the games. He wasn't losing the games he was supposed to win all that often. There are certainly some exceptions we can point to there, but like it's to say that like the level of talent was also a factor in there. That perhaps had the Bears had a more talented team, maybe they would have won more games under Matt Nagy. It speaks to, I think, some of it at best the mediocrity of the Matt Nagy coaching staff, but also pointing out that like, hey, talent is a factor in this too, and that's going to be a lot of how we measure Matt Eberflus and Luke Getsy and Alan Williams and all the coaching staff is how much are they able to squeeze out of the talent that they do have? Is the talent able to play up to the opponents that they face, in game situations like that? Do they not play down to the opponents that they face? Because sometimes it felt like Matt Nagy's teams would play down a little bit, but they still would ultimately typically tend to win most of those types of games, even if they did sort of step down to face that level of opponent. But that's always one of those, it's not super quantitative and measurable, but it is one of those sort of measures, more of an abstract measure of how we feel about a coaching staff and how they respond to those situations. But some of that, and dare I say a lot of that, is going to come down to the talent the Bears do have to work with, which, as of right now, is not particularly stellar at some key positions heading into this 2022 season. So we'll take a closer look at, okay, where does scheme play into this? What can scheme and coaching staff changes like this do for a team to elevate them, and what can't those, the coaching staff do in this type of dynamic here? Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at rockauto.com. They're an online auto parts dealers that have been serving customers for over 20 years. They are experts at this, and they've got everything you could possibly need for your vehicle. I mean, parts that I don't understand how they work to the easy stuff like, motor oil and tail lamps and even new carpet for inside your vehicle. Whatever you're looking for, rockauto.com's catalog is so deep, but it's really easy to navigate too. You just enter in your car's make and model, and then it quickly pulls up all the different parts for your vehicle that you can sort by then the brands, the specifications, and the prices that you prefer. Don't pay up to twice as much for the same part somewhere else. Head on over to rockauto.com today and see all the different parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, fill out the box that says, "How did you hear about us?" and write in the words "Locked On." That way they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. There are key ways that this new Chicago Bears coaching staff can be noticeably better and an upgrade from the Matt Nagy regime, which is a low bar, but more so have a noticeable impact on how this team performs and fix some of the things that Matt Nagy was not doing properly, but it can't fix all of the things. We talked about some of this idea on yesterday's podcast about Justin Fields specifically. This idea that, why we should expect Fields to be better this season generally is in large part because, unlike the Nagy coaching staff, this Matt Eberflus regime is saying, yes, from the get-go, it sounds obvious, but compared to last year, Justin Fields is the starter. Justin Fields is throwing almost literally all the reps, all of the throws at these offseason practices have been going to Justin Fields. He's getting every opportunity he can to practice with his teammates, learn the playbook and all these things, as opposed to last year when Justin Fields is the backup to Andy Dalton the whole time and doesn't really practice with the starting wide receivers until the regular season when Andy Dalton gets hurt and Justin Fields has to take in the starting lineup. He's not having to build that chemistry on the fly. He's building it now and has been building it all offseason with Darnell Mooney, and I guess once the other receivers came into the fold with them as well. But like, they're able to much more tailor everything to Fields in a way that the Matt Nagy coaching staff did not do. And that is a very clear and I think real concrete measurement or a concrete example of where this coaching staff is already going to be better for this Bears team than Matt Nagy's coaching staff was last year. But at the same time, scheme and coaching can't necessarily fully make up for where you have perhaps very real potential talent deficiencies. And that's where it's hard to know when the players weren't necessarily being put in a best position to be successful last season, and you have new players coming in from new teams in new situations. But like, the perfect play call doesn't always necessarily mean that Byron Pringle or Equanimeous St. Brown or Velus Jones is going to be open on that play. There are ways in which scheme can get players open, but it's not something that you can fully rely on in the place of having wide receivers who also have, route running ability and the ability to separate and have speed and create those open windows for Justin Fields to make. So like, for example, a screen pass is one way to sort of create an open wide receiver. We're kind of sick of screen passes from the Matt Nagy era, but that type of thing, or sometimes, a run pass option play where it's looking like you're going to run the ball, so the linebacker steps up to try and stop the run, creates that space to where the wide receiver is going to run to where that linebacker was. That's a way you can scheme open players, right? You can have certain designs that pull defensive players in certain directions for certain reasons that create space for a receiver to move into. It's not necessarily sustainable to have an entire offense be fully reliant on that, and there are going to be times when your wide receivers need to get open on their own. Same kind of thing with the offensive line, right? There are things you can do schematically to help a bad offensive line. You can call rollouts and get the quarterback moving away from the pass rushers in the pocket. You can have extra pass protectors like tight ends and running backs in to help the struggling offensive lineman block. Those are things you can do to sometimes make up for where you might have talent deficiencies on the offensive line. But that's not necessarily something you can do every single play. You can't run a rollout or have extra pass protection in every single play on your offense. It's just not a sustainable way of functioning. And then also, I think when you combine those two things, I'm not an expert by any means in offensive scheme, but I don't necessarily know if there's a lot of ways to both scheme open receivers and scheme up the pass protection at the same time. I suppose like a run pass option sort of does both, and I guess to some extent a screen pass does too. But right, it's not as simple as like, okay, we're going to leave in extra pass protectors and we're going to call the special types of plays that are automatically going to get receivers open regardless of their real level of route running. There are going to be a number of plays, if not more, a majority of plays where you're going to need your 5 offensive linemen to hold up in pass protection, and you're going to need your wide receivers to just flat out like get open. And not that there's not a route concept to help him, but the route concept is more for the quarterback to be able to say, okay, under this route concept, I'm looking for this coverage, and if it's this coverage against these routes, then I know who to throw to. But the route concept itself isn't always what's going to get the wide receiver open. If the receiver's running a dig route, an in or an out or a post or a corner or whatever it is, like when they make their cut, right, they have to sell their release off the line of scrimmage. They have to sort of sell their speed and make sure the defender doesn't know exactly where they're going to go, right? There's a lot of nuances to route running, and the same thing in pass protection. And the players at some point are going to have to be good enough to execute regular standard offense. And I know there's no blanket type of regular standard offense, but plays that are not specifically schemed to help the offensive line or specifically schemed to automatically get the receivers open. And this also, I think, applies to defense, although that's not as immediately pressing of a concern as far as talent goes, because we liked what we had seen from the defense in previous years. And yes, there's been some deficiencies there, but less of the immediate concern, but it does apply to that side of the ball. Really, the big issue is offensive line and wide receiver right now in terms of helping Justin Fields. Same thing in the running game too with David Montgomery, right? You can, if your offensive line is struggling to run block, you can sort of like try and pitch it to the edge and get outside, so the offensive line is not as important on some of those plays, or run a jet sweep or an end around where again you're getting it out into space and not relying on the offensive line as much. But maybe that's an easier way to think of it. You can't just run jet sweeps and toss sweeps and stuff. Like sometimes you just have to hand the ball off up the middle, and you need your offensive line to block. There's ways to help the offensive line, but you can't do that on every single play, and you're going to need those players to play well. And that's where it comes back to. Like, just because if Luke Getsy comes in and is an infinitely better play caller than Matt Nagy, that can't be everything, right? That can't be the fix for every one of the Bears' problems. At some point, players are going to need to play well, and we'll look a little bit more specifically at who's going to need to play well, what the expectation should be, how they might be able to play well, and also how the coaching staff might be able to help individual players also take their game to the next level. Next on Locked On Bears. The Locked On Bears podcast is powered by Built Bars, the makers of the world's best tasting protein bars. Built Bar keeps always putting out delicious flavors, and I'm a big fan of the coconut brownie chunk puff. It's like the regular Built Bar, but the Built Puffs have more of like a chewy marshmallow type consistency as opposed to more of the candy bar flavor that you get from regular Built Bars. Built Puffs are more like chocolate-covered marshmallows. Built Bars are candy bars, all covered in 100% real chocolate. And whether it's a puff or a bar, they're all still good for you. Every Built Puff, every Built Bar is low sugar, low calories, high fiber, and high protein. It is truly the best of both worlds. Tastes delicious, satisfies the sweet tooth, and is healthy and good for you. I'm telling you, it sounds good to be true, but once you taste it, you will believe it just like I do. I have one literally every single day. Head over to Built.com, enter in our promo code LOCKED15, and you're going to get 15% off your next order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Heard me struggling there at the end. Rough. All right. So we've established, I hope fairly clearly, that players are going to need to be better. And like, I know that that's something that sounds obvious, but I just want to make sure the big sort of premise here is like, let's not put all our eggs in coaching staff will solve all problems. Players also need to perform at a high level. And we have concerns on paper right now of at how high of a level the offensive line and wide receivers will perform, which will then have a direct impact on how well Justin Fields can perform and how sort of the future of the offense develops from there. And just to a lesser extent, well, maybe not even a lesser extent, but also how well David Montgomery and the running game are able to perform, which will then also affect how well Justin Fields is able to perform and how well the defense is. And football is this complex intricacy of, like symbiosis between all the different, it takes 11 guys and all the cliches that coaches say all the time. I've been trying to avoid the X's and O's, Jimmy's and Joe's thing because it's so overdone, and all of those are, but that's sort of truly what it does come down to. And so when you look specifically on this Bears offense and some of these players that you're going to need to count on, right? You're going to need Tevin Jenkins and Larry Borum, or maybe Braxton Jones, but your starting offensive tackles, right? Those guys are going to need to take steps forward, and perhaps the push from the regime to have them drop in some weight. It seemed like Juan Castillo had them particularly heavy and wanted them more in that bulkier type of position, but perhaps more of this lighter, more agile offensive line combined with an outside zone scheme that it doesn't seem like it's quite Larry Borum's perfect scheme fit if we're talking about, still generally a bigger, slower type of offensive tackle, but he seemed to be able to hold up at that position okay last season. I don't think he's going to be like a terrible fit in the scheme by no means, but like, it's not, when you talk about like ideal fits, it's not exactly ideal for Larry Borum. It's more ideal for Cody Whitehair, who can move, for Lucas Patrick, who's coming over from the same offense, right? It should help them. Even if Sam Mustipher ends up as your starting right guard, he's more of a mover than a big, strong anchor type of lineman. So like in those ways, the scheme can help your athletic offensive linemen that you do have that you can trust to be athletic, to put them in a more advantageous position than, say, like a power gap scheme where you need to be big and heavy and strong and not as agile. So, right, there's those ways. And, of course, just in general, like quality assistant coaches help develop players. But like, it's really easy to say, well, like, okay, Nagy regime is gone, so this new coaching staff will be infinitely then better at specifically developing individual players at individual positions. And there's certainly something to be said, I think, perhaps fairly valid criticism of Mike Furry as a wide receivers coach, for example, compared to like Tyke Tolbert, the new wide receivers coach, who has a much more proven track record of developing receivers at the NFL level. And Mike Furry, not so much of that happening in Chicago. There's also a person outside of that. But like offensive line, for example, Juan Castillo, the Bears offensive line coach, had a really strong reputation as an offensive line coach and a defensive coach. I mean, just in coaching in general, in his previous stops in the NFL. And before that, Harry Hiestand, a strong reputation and some real track record examples of like players that he has coached that have improved. And we didn't see that happen in Chicago specifically with really like clear examples of a player who started at one point and then over the couple of years like consistently got a lot better and growing into a bigger and better role. I mean, James Daniels sort of, but he was also hurt in there, and it's hard to get a sense of like, and he was being moved around a lot. There were certainly decisions with the offensive line personnel changes that I didn't agree with the coaching staff, but I don't think it was purely a reflection on their ability to develop players. And I don't think it's fair to just assume that new offensive line coach Chris Morgan will all of a sudden be this absolute expert in developing all the young offensive linemen. Because, I mean, maybe he is very good at it, but Juan Castillo has also been good at it before, and Harry Hiestand has also been good at it before. So it's not always as simple as just like, okay, new position coach is instantly going to develop these players much better than previous position coach. I believe it a little more at wide receiver than I do for offensive line, but it's not going to be universally true with any individual player, because the player also has to like put in the work and develop, and they can't just be the coach. There has to be, it's a two-way street there. But then like you look at wide receiver, for example, right? We can expect Darnell Mooney to be Darnell Mooney. That's pretty well standard. Byron Pringle comes in. He's had some production in Kansas City, but they need him to be, I think, better than what we've seen from him in Kansas City. He's just coming off his career best year of 568 yards and 42 catches and 5 touchdowns, playing a lot in the slot there, but can obviously do some stuff outside too. They need him to be a better player in Chicago, and perhaps that's something the coaching staff can have more of an influence on, right? That they can give him a bigger role and perhaps put him in not necessarily like purely better positions to succeed than like Andy Reid was specifically, but more opportunities to succeed and more times where he's going to be perhaps earlier in the progression in Chicago than he would have been in Kansas City. So then he's going to potentially have more targets, a more featured role, more opportunities to have to catch. I mean, things like that, not that Andy Reid wasn't using him properly, but just the number of opportunities based on the other personnel that they had might not have been as bountiful for Byron Pringle. And maybe schematically too, there's some things that Luke Getsy could do better for Pringle than Andy Reid was, because they're not going to tailor the Chiefs offense to Byron Pringle. I mean, they got Hill and Kelsey, and Pringle's got to fit in there. And not that the Bears are going to tailor their whole offense to Pringle either, but like maybe it can be a little more Pringle friendly because he's going to be a little bit more featured in Chicago than it would have been for him in Kansas City. Or same kind of thing for Equanimous St. Brown or any of the receivers they brought in, Dante Pettis and Tajay Sharp and David Moore. I mean, all those guys, plus then Velus Jones to kind of come in and mix with this too. So like they're going to need Byron Pringle to consistently get open and make catches and make plays after the catch and score touchdowns. And they're going to need, whether it's Velus Jones or somebody else, to step up and again, like consistently get open, be a effective route runner to create separation for Justin Fields. And they're going to need their offensive tackles to really step up and play better than they did last season. And for Jenkins and Borum, them being rookies last season, we should expect that even if it had been Matt Nagy again and the same coaching staff, that just from year one to year two, they could settle in a little bit more and have a little bit more confidence and not be as thrown into the fire as both of them kind of joining the starting lineup halfway through late in the season. The same way that, now Fields gets the full time as a starter. I guess now Jenkins and Borum are moving around a little bit, but Jenkins is healthy at this point, and that's a big difference from last year. And Borum getting more like starting reps against starting opponents can help aid the development and practice as well when he's not going against purely backups the entire time. So there's potential for growth in those processes as well. But if Sam Mustipher is going to be your starting right guard, he needs to play better than he did last season at center. And I don't know that we should expect like this huge random year 3 jump from Sam Mustipher when it's a new scheme and maybe that can help a little bit, but like pass protection is going to, at the end of the day, it's still pass protection. And whether he's at right guard or center, he's just going to need to be better. And if he's not better, there's going to be if he's the starting right guard and he's not better, there's going to be some real problems for this Bears offensive line. And it's same is true for any of those guys, and same is true for the wide receivers, right? The coaching staff can do some to coach them up, can do some things schematically to make their jobs a little bit easier. But at the end of the day, those are the types of guys that just need to be better, not only better this season than they were last season, but be better this season than what the Bears had at their spots for the most part last season. Not that you can expect Byron Pringle to be better than an Allen Robinson, but the wide receiving core needs to be better than it was last season as a whole. Probably not going to be on paper, but you never know, right? There's unproven guys and opportunities here. Offensive line, you want it to be better than it was last season. Doesn't look like it talent-wise on paper right now, but there's opportunities for these younger players to step into bigger roles, advance their careers another year forward, and perhaps in a better position scheme-wise in some cases that can also help mitigate some of that problem. Coaching staff can do a lot. Can't fix all of the woes from the Matt Nagy era. That's what it comes down to, and that's where personnel is going to be a big factor in this, and that's going to be the evaluation on Ryan Poles. And it's not fair to look at how these players all perform in 2022 and say, okay, if these guys were bad, Ryan Poles is therefore terrible at talent evaluation. That's not necessarily the case, but we are wondering what this is going to look like and how many of these players will prove to be longer-term foundational pieces for this Bears offense and for the entire team, because the defense is part of this conversation too. Many of the same concepts apply, just not as pressing of an immediate concern on paper in June. You can be sure we'll keep tabs on all the development of these players and how the scheme affects them and how the coaching kind of goes through training camp and so much more. So I hope you'll keep tuning in and subscribe to the Locked On Bears podcast to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis all offseason long. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We'll be here not every day. We're doing 3 days a week in the offseason, but we'll ramp back up to 5 days as we get into training camp and get you all set for the regular season and beyond. So appreciate you tuning in, and I hope that the Locked On Bears podcast helps make it a little bit easier for you to bear down.